morning, afternoon and evening to all of you from Kensington Palace Gardens. Hi John, how are you?
Hi, good afternoon to you, Marvi. I'm in good spirit.
And today we're going to be discussing change management, a concept that we've all been thinking about a lot, have we not? And I think I would like to start off from a conceptual point of view. How do we look at change management? I don't want to look at the traditional definition, which is change management. The whole world does that. We're not the whole world. I would like to look at change and management and change and have a paradigm shift a little bit. Now, clearly change is inevitable. It's continuous. As they say, there's two certainties in the world, taxes and death. I would like to add a third one, change.
Absolutely.
So that's our tagline, isn't it? And as far as change post-pandemic is concerned, there's a couple of factors that I'd like to put forward to our viewers. Number one, there's been a lot of work from home, the hybrid system, which is specific to post-pandemic, and it's continuing clearly. Number two, what we call the great resignation. And what I mean by that, it's like the gig economy versus the salaried employees, okay? And government stimulus, a lot of government stimulus has been given, benefits have been given, which are contributing to the great resignation as such. The third one is specific. It's DocuSign and Zoom, the culture of Zoom and DocuSign, which was not there before, clearly. Their usage has increased, and changed how business was done in pre-pandemic and post-pandemic and during pandemic. Now, should the legislation have followed? Now, these are things I want you to think about. Should the legislation have followed suit now that there's been a change in the way we work? The fourth one is supply chain crisis. Clearly, you've seen that, especially as far as the war is concerned, the kind of supply chain issues we've had. And the fifth one is specific, not just to you in UK, but generally, it's the use of the Elizabeth line, meaning Canary Wharf has been linked to Heathrow. And that's has that been a policy shift? Has government followed society's needs as such, or how has that change been managed? Now, when we talk about management, so we've talked about a few changes that we have seen post-pandemic, what about management? The unmanaged change, in my opinion, John, creates and leads to disorganized chaos. It's very dangerous. And we have seen plenty of that as well. You will agree that parliaments and executive branches who have dealt better with COVID have survived COVID better. They're doing better after the pandemic. Now, the question really arises, and then this is my last question here for now, and then I'll pass it to you. Can change be legislated, or can its management be legislated? And should it be a public-private partnership between society, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and corporates as such? Over to you, John.
Well, I think all of the actors that you mentioned can be part of a change process,
yes,
or indeed they can have separately their own change processes.
Yes.
The only certainty is, in a sense, the certainty, Marvi, with which you started, and that is that realistically no change is not an option. The
yes,
notion that you can just stand still and do everything the same way forever is, I think, literally incredible. In the commercial world, I've always felt that no change is not an option because companies don't realistically stand still. They either advance absolutely or relatively by comparison with their competitors, or they decline absolutely or relatively by comparison with their competitors. They don't stand still.
True.
And I think that the great majority of organisations, be they commercial outfits, professional bodies, charitable institutions, public sector organisations, do have to change if they're going to do things better. If they don't change, they start to ossify and they start to look very out of touch. I must confess, I think that Parliament historically has tended to be very slow to change, and it needs to speed up. It has tended to rest on its laurels and to think that traditions that have existed for a long time should be preserved almost in aspic, and that seems to me to be no longer a credible proposition. For example, because of technology, the speed at which everything happens is that much greater, and information flows are that much quicker. So Parliament's tendency to have agendas formed some several days in advance, is, in my opinion, a tendency from which it needs to move away. Now, there have been some modest steps in recent years, over the last 15 years or so, there have been more topical questions in Parliament that have been allowed, and I made a big point of saying, well, we must have more urgent questions that aren't provided for on the agenda, but which the Speaker's got a right to select, because if everybody in the workplace and around the family dinner table and in the dog and duck
discussing today,
is discussing
now,
X
1 hour
issue,
back,
and we're discussing Y issue,
5 days back,
it just looks completely disconnected, and people think we're out of touch.
Agreed.
So, you know, for me, it was a question of deciding this is a change that falls within my gift, and I can do it through my own power, so I'm going to make this change. And there will be a certain amount of huffing and puffing, and some people will say, oh, but that's not been done before, Mr. Speaker, or it's something that should happen only very occasionally. And I remember sort of saying, well, where does it say that it happens only very occasionally? To which the answer was, well, it doesn't say that anywhere, it's just that it's always been understood.
There's
that
always
something
been
is judged
understood
urgent
as
only very occasionally, and I said, well, it may always have been understood that way, but I think that understanding is out of date, and it doesn't need to be that way. So that was sort of, if you like, the intellectually lazy argument. Oh, it's always been understood to mean this, or oh, don't do that, Mr. Speaker, it's never been done before, or oh, Mr. Speaker, you've got to do it this way. Why? Well, it's always been done that way. Those arguments are lazy, and they're very out of kilter with the disciplines of the marketplace, which focus much more on the here and now, and what works and what's going to be effective. So my overall feeling is that change is inevitable, and the question is whether you have change foisted upon you or whether you try to manage and embrace the process of change. Change management. Now, if you decide that you want changes, it's a good idea to build allies, to point out the advantages, to try to minimise the opposition, and to try to persuade people that they shouldn't view it always or only as a threat.
Yes.
There may be some uncomfortable aspects of it, but there will be opportunities as well. There will be positive features. And broadly speaking, I found with a number of the reforms or changes that I championed that yes, there were people who were against, and you had to accept, Marvi. You had to accept that you weren't going to be universally popular. If you're the sort of person who doesn't want a row, isn't interested in a fuss, just wants to work throughout a career and collect the pension and just be a pretty sort of safe pair of hands but not make any great difference, well, fine. I don't think there's much point in that. You know, my attitude was that I wanted to do things, and if you want to do things, it doesn't mean you should do them recklessly or with no regard for the level of criticism you're going to get, but what it means is, I think, that you decide on your priorities, and then you think, well, how can I bring allies with me? How can I minimise the opposition? And how can I build up a track record of doing this new thing in such a way that after a period of weeks, or certainly of months and of years, people will say, this makes sense. To the extent, Marvi, that people forget that they were ever against in the first place.
So, John, coming back to change management, I really want to bring this point about Parliament across. Should Parliament drive change proactively, or should it react to societal changes? Now, I want to bring an example from the United States of America. The Roe versus Wade situation, the case, the whole controversy, what has happened with the Supreme Court, how the Supreme Court has led versus the legislative branch leading, or versus society leading. And also their Second Amendment, their whole debate about the gun situation. It's a very divided society. It's becoming more and more divided. But besides the division, my concern is who's leading the change in that country. If there's always a gap, and institutions who are supposed to, or societies which are supposed to lead that change, are not seen to be leading it, then others take the advantage and they fill in the blanks. And this is an example which is very specific to Pakistan, how the military has been very active in politics, and the logic has been given that the politicians have taken a different kind of attitude, and therefore the military has taken. I don't buy that generally, but that's, you know, if institutions will leave a space, others will take charge in the middle. I'm coming back to specifically the legislative branch, and now, you know, the judicial branch in the US. And also public opinion should drive legislation, should it not? I mean, I remember, like, we've been discussing this throughout our parliamentary pondering, that how if I saw an injustice in society, for example, that acid crime issue, then I legislated as a result of me seeing an injustice in society. So society forced me to legislate. But this is a question. The examples of societal change which corporates need to manage today, other than the ones I listed right at the beginning, the work from home, social media, alternative energy, and electric cars. I'm taking 4 examples. There are millions more, but just these 4, if we were to zoom in on it. Now, when you look at the work from home aspect, what are the corporates looking at? The employees are always on the job. Lines between the office and the home are blurred. Who is responsible for the mental health in this case? Who is responsible for the productivity of the employee? Who is responsible for workmanship and related liability? The corporate, the legislative branch, the executive branch. Who is legislating to help this process of change? Who is managing the change? Now let's look at the social media side, and then I'll pass it on to you. All over the world, is it one to too many, or is it one-on-one communication? Now, when you look at the public tete-a-tete between Elon Musk and, which is happening on Twitter right now, I mean, his whole, his attack, his whole business attack is on Twitter. Should this change, should be legislated, or do we expect corporations to self-manage that by having policies and procedures themselves? Are we going to help them, or are they going to do it themselves? Or are we going to do it together? I mean, the idea for me, I don't want to give my opinion too early, but I think for me, it should be a public-private partnership. We've got PPPs in different areas. Why not a public-private partnership that we propose for this to happen? And also, if you look at, the kind of social media and traditional media, the lines between them are blurring. And the corporate advertising communication is happening on social media as we speak. So what are legislators supposed to do in this particular situation? How do we manage the change?
Well, I suppose my starting point is that although you and I are political,
yes,
because we've both got political backgrounds,
yes,
you as a government minister, me as a speaker, we need to be careful not to regard everything as automatically demanding of formal political action.
Okay.
Everything is political in the sense that it might be the matter of dispute or contestation or
yes,
alternative emphases and interpretations between different people. And if you call that political because it's a matter of difference of opinion, then it's political. But not everything requires
legislation,
political action, or indeed in particular legislative action. Okay. So, for example, my own personal view is that the question of working from home or not is not something that requires any legislative action at all. That is something that I think businesses can be relied upon to take a stand on and to lead, not necessarily all in the same direction. It might depend on the nature of the business, the product or the service, but I think they could be relied upon to take a view on it, not least because it does very much relate to their pounds, shillings and pence, their profitability. So it's not even just something where it might be culturally desirable to have one stance rather than another stance. They as a business will have thought about it. And some have decided, right, the nature of our business is such that we can have very significant numbers of our staff working from home and maybe checking in once a week or twice a week, and we can save a shed load of money in our property portfolio by having people not operate entirely as independent franchisees. They're still employees, but working from home significant amounts of the time. Some will. Others will say, no, the nature of the product or the service is such that we will always need a significant number of people in one place at the same time. I think there's a related point, and that is that although there are benefits from home working in terms of saving on travel costs, and companies in some cases perhaps thinking, well, we don't need such large real estate, we don't have to be paying these huge commercial rents if we need a smaller building only, and those are positives. There are negatives. What are the negatives? There can be a real detriment to mental health if somebody is cooped up. It's one thing, it's a novelty at first, and during the pandemic I think it was a novelty at first. People thought, oh good, I don't have to go traipsing into the office. Okay, it's unpleasant that we've got this awful pandemic, but I can work from home and I'm trusted to do so, and I can just walk next door from one room to another, and if I want to pop downstairs and make a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or have a bite to eat, I can, and I'm not being tracked every minute of the day. As long as I get the job done, people are content, my bosses are content. But there can be a mental health deficit.
Certainly.
And I think there is a terrible lack of social interaction. In fact, I also think, I remember speaking to a city audience a few months ago and floating this point, and there seemed to be much concurrence with it, that from the vantage point of some of the more senior people in the business, it's less of a problem because they're known quantities, they're established leaders, they're at the top of the pile. For some of the more junior staff, the inability to mix and to perform in front of their seniors is a real disadvantage. Or to learn from
teamwork generally. You
I
don't
think that's a
perform
real
in
problem.
isolation.
And you don't just
teams.
sitting on, you know, your
difficult.
chair at home in front of a PC. So those are matters of the highest importance, but I think companies can be relied upon to make their own judgments about them. Whereas there are other things, what I would call big public policy issues, where in my view, and our viewers will have a range of opinions about it, there's much to be said for Parliament's not just playing catch up, but choosing to be pioneers. Now, historically in Britain, this is a hugely simplistic summary, but a lot of change was bottom up. A lot of change, for example, to accord rights to working people, recognition of trade unions, etc. A lot of those changes didn't come about first and foremost in Parliament. They came about because people organised, people protested, people complained, people highlighted their grievances, and gradually there came to be forces in Parliament that heeded some of those complaints and adjusted. But if you look back over a period in my country of 50, 60 years, I think it's a good thing that Parliament has led. When Parliament in the UK abolished the death penalty, it abolished capital punishment in 1965, that wouldn't have been the preference of the public opinion. It wouldn't have been. No, public opinion at the time would have been against. But does that therefore make it wrong? No. In my opinion, it doesn't. It doesn't make it wrong at all. I think Parliament should do what it believes is right. And in some cases, it will be unpopular, and people will eventually, one thinks, one hopes, one expects, I think I know, will come round. Similarly, I think it's true to say that on abortion, the legislation in the late 60s by the British Parliament was probably ahead of public opinion, which was more socially conservative. I think it was the right thing to do, as I think Roe v. Wade was the right thing to do, and I think now, albeit America is hugely divided on the subject, more divided than in Britain, there's a very strong religiosity in the United States, which tends to be rather socially conservative. But I think American legislators and the Supreme Court did the right thing in taking the more liberal stance on abortion, and I think the change from that is wrong. On the ownership of guns, and I know this is very sensitive terrain, and any of our American viewers will have a view on it, and some will be in favour of gun control and some won't. My own personal view is that this slogan, an armed society is a safe society, is wrong. I think if you have an enormous proliferation of guns, you are more likely to have random incidents of slaughter. And I always thought it was a terribly sad fact that the gun lobby was, as it is still, so powerful in the United States that although President Obama wanted to do something about it, he was hamstrung. But was it the right thing to do for Congress or a president to try to act? Or should you proceed on the basis of government by opinion poll? No, I subscribe to what I call the Berkean theory of representation, the conservative statesman stroke philosopher Edmund Burke, who was himself a parliamentarian. And this will rather shock you, Marvi, because of course he was speaking in the 18th century, but in his letter to the electors of Bristol in 1774, he said, as your representative, as your member of Parliament, I owe you not merely my industry, my honour, but my judgment, and I betray, instead of serving, if I sacrifice my judgment to your opinion. Now, some people would say, wow, that's very elitist, that's very pompous and high-minded and imperious of him. He was basically saying, I know better than you. And he was. He was, of course, also saying that in an era at a time when very, 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 very large numbers of people were not fully educated, and universal participation in primary education was barely a gleam in the eye of most statesmen.
Women's status was
vastly inferior to what it is today. So it was a different age, it's true. But my own personal opinion is that a member of Parliament is not a delegate, he or she is a representative. And so now and again I would take a stance as a member of Parliament before I became Speaker, and I sometimes did during the course of my speakership, not necessarily knowing that it was going to be the majority view in my constituency. And did I even really much care whether it was the majority view in my constituency? No, I thought this is the right thing to do. And now and again I would encounter somebody who would say, well, Mr. Bercow, you spoke in favour of X, or you voted Y. What consultation did you do with us? You know, what soundings did you take? And I would in some cases say, I didn't. I didn't. I would have no way of knowing what 75,000 disparate electors in my Buckingham constituency
can't take a poll of,
I can't
like
conduct
a sample poll.
Representation by opinion poll. You elected me at least in part to exercise my judgment. I have versed myself in the issue, I've read, I've thought about it, I've listened to what other people have to say, and I've formed a view. And I think sometimes you trusted me to take a leadership role, absolutely.
And to manage change.
And to manage change, yeah, absolutely. And of course it's in the nature of things that change by definition involves a departure from previous precedent. And you know, I had that discussion, that argument if you like, towards the end of my speakership when I made some decisions that involved a change from previous practice, and some of my critics said, oh, but that's a change, it's not in keeping with the precedents. And I said, that's true, but every so often, as in a legal case, a new precedent is established. Because if we were guided exclusively by precedent, manifestly, nothing would ever change.
No progress could be made.
So, you know,
John, we're going to go to the hot seat part of the episode. So, change processes that you have led or been part of that you wish to talk about. Over to you. The first one-liner.
Okay.
For the speaker, it's very difficult one-liner.
Right. My first change was to increase the number of urgent questions in Parliament. We were much too inclined to stick to an agenda that was a week old and not to be discussing the things the public was discussing. And I said, if I'm elected, there will be an urgency about our proceedings. There were objections, some people didn't like it, it was thought to be bold, I was told I would make enemies, all of which was true, but it was the right thing to do.
Excellent. My first one I remember was Citibank credit cards. We launched credit cards for Pakistan. It was a new.
Yeah.
It was complete change from cash, and we were told, how are you going to get this product to actually make money or actually function or actually be accepted in Pakistan? We were young. We were part of the marketing team. We made it happen as part of a larger team.
And did you get objections?
Oh, we got plenty of them, but we solved them all. And credit cards is obviously now, can a country live without credit cards? And this was 1990s, it was mid-90s. So credit cards entered Pakistan only in mid-90s. And when I look at another change, SMS, I was the first SMS of Pakistan was fired by my own house because we needed it in those days. Now that's the point. SMS is now so outdated that we talk about WhatsApp. I'm glad that you reacted like that. You know?
Sure.
Because SMS was the new thing in the 90s, you know, in 2000. 2000 Feb was when Pakistan's first SMS was launched. And I'm sure it was launched much earlier in other countries. But we were the change makers in those days, bringing that forward. And nobody had heard of SMS. And now you can't live without WhatsApp, SMS, whatever. So this was technology for you. Over to you.
Emergency debates became more commonplace during my tenure. It's strange, really. There were all sorts of crises occurring domestically and around the world,
of course, and
have been for decades.
The change management of it.
And yet, we very rarely had emergency debates in Parliament. And sometimes I just thought, this situation cries out for a change of the business and an emergency debate. And the Speaker had some power in relation to that. And again, I had very, very traditionalist, stuffed shirt, change-resistant characters counselling against, and I thought, no, this is actually what Parliament should be doing, and it will be of interest to the media, of interest to colleagues, and of interest to the public. So I think 35 times over the years I said there should be an emergency debate. Do you know, I can hardly recall any occasion when what I would call the old guard officials were in favour. They weren't in favour. They tended to say, oh, put it off. Think again, Mr. Speaker, what about next week or tomorrow, some other time, as long as it wasn't now. So you just have to trust your instincts and think, is this the right thing to do? And if so, even if there is a bit of a fuss, the fuss will die down. And it did.
My next one I think of is when I was in the investment ministry and I was advisor to the minister in those days, and we were negotiating bilateral investment treaties and we were doing free trade agreements, and those were very difficult to manage because there were so many stakeholders that you needed to manage. So the change was tremendous on all sides, and to negotiate those within all the stakeholders was a tough one, but we managed that.
But you did it.
We managed that change. Now you can see the variation in terms of, you know, from technology to bilateral investment treaties. You next.
I established a workplace nursery
within
of becoming Speaker, and it was surely the right thing to do. But at the time, even though it might strike your and my listeners and viewers as a very minor change, there were people who behaved as though this was revolutionary. And why are you doing that? And it's going to cost money, and surely people can make arrangements for their own childcare. It was very, very old-fashioned, backward-looking. It would have been a male-dominated environment. And I just took the view, no, this is what I want to do. And I thought, right, well, I'm going to get on side some allies who will benefit from this and who can see the argument for it and who can see the read across to private sector operations where these facilities are now becoming increasingly commonplace. And we'll make it happen. And there'll probably be a row, and it will then be set up. And I reckon within 3 years, it will be heavily subscribed, so it will be the situation of 70, 80, 90% capacity. And the row will be subdued and will eventually disappear. And that's exactly what happened. And does anybody now say, oh, well, there shouldn't be a nursery? No, but at the time, it was thought to be bold. So am I proud of the fact that we ended up with a nursery but no shooting gallery, whereas when I started, there was a shooting gallery but no nursery? Surely that was changed for the better.
Absolutely.
But, you know, it needed somebody to grip it.
Okay, coming back to my time when I was functioning as the advisor for media for President Musharraf, I was functioning as a civilian within a military setup as a young woman, and pushing a completely new concept of media management and setting up a cell. I feel very fortunate that my stakeholders, the military in particular, took the changes that I proposed as a young woman. They were in boots and they were certainly not young. They were men, and they
were military men.
They were military men,
which tends to mean quite old-fashioned men.
But they took the change so beautifully. I remember that every new process that was proposed was accepted, approved, and implemented beautifully, and a beautiful media cell was established, and now it's huge.
Now, because I think this is of really enormous interest to people, this was a big change in a conservative environment for which you ended up having military people cheering you on. How did it happen? Was it sheer persistence? Was it the quality of your personal communication?
Well, I mean, I don't want to boast too much about myself. I'd rather that the leadership, in particular at that time, President Musharraf, he was driving that change. He approved.
Right, he was driving that change, but only when you had persuaded him of it.
Oh yeah, so he saw the benefit of it. So you need, for change management to work, you need to show benefits of the change. You can't expect people to embrace the change or for you to manage the change without showing genuine positive impact.
Yes, that I think is an important point. Yeah. That's a very important point because we're talking about practical change and workplaces, be they parliaments or companies or public sector bodies. So in other words, change cannot just be about a theoretical idea. There has to be an output.
Yeah, an output.
You've got to be able to say, these are the positive benefits, and you probably have to be able to give some indication of how quickly they'll come on stream, because most people don't want to work on the basis of a wing and a prayer. They want a reasonable assurance that change that is beneficial will happen fairly soon.
Yeah, for sure. So that was huge. And then recently, during my time in the cabinet, I was asked to managed a very difficult process. Along with many other cabinet ministers, we were part of a team which was negotiating on Pakistan's behalf of the Financial Action Task Force. And that process went on. It wasn't just our government, the government before, our government, and then the government after, and then the government after. So at least 4 governments in front of me were part of that process. But did we manage a certain amount of change during our time? Yes. Was it the toughest change management negotiations I've done, where my country's stakes were very high, and whatever I was saying or doing, I represented my country, and the results of it could be disastrous if I got it right, wrong, and if I got it right, it could be useful.
Yeah.
So that pressure of delivering change when it impacted the entire country, 220 million people's lives are at stake. I know it sounds a bit dramatic, but it was dramatic. And each one of us within the team were committed. All the ministers were committed to that process. The ones that had been selected to push that process. Not everyone in the cabinet had been selected for that. So that was, I think, the toughest negotiations I've been to. I was sent to South Korea and Japan for that. I don't want to say more on that. Over to you.
Diverse staff appointments were important to me. I was very struck when I took up post as Speaker by the fact that of 84 senior Commons Service staff, not one identified as BAME, not one. And the number of women in senior positions was very small. At an early stage I decided this must change. This House on the staff side needs to look more like the country we're charged to represent. I made several senior appointments over the years of people who were not from that traditional white upper middle class male category. I appointed the first BAME Speaker's chaplain in the history of the House of Commons, Rose Hudson Wilkin, who's now the Bishop of Dover and really the Archbishop of Canterbury's deputy.
Award?
She was there at the dinner.
I remember her really well.
She was there at the dinner for your award, Marvi, absolutely, in Speaker's House, and she's
she
gone
was
on
also
to
there
greater
at
things.
The Duke and Duchess of Sussex's wedding.
She was.
Wasn't she?
Well remembered. She most certainly was. Yes, I mean she's become a very, very celebrated figure across the country.
That was a good appointment, John.
Well, it was a good appointment, but I'll tell you something. At the time I appointed her, she wasn't originally on the shortlist. And you know why?
You're taking a...
There were no women on the shortlist.
Amazing.
And amazingly, the people in charge of this process thought it was legitimate for there to be an all-male
So it was top
shortlist.
Down, clearly. If you had not made an effort, it wouldn't have happened.
I said, I think now the expression, which didn't really exist then, is press pause. If you don't like the process, and you're a decision maker in it, you can press pause. In other words, you can revisit it and do it all over again. And I said, well, I'm not prepared to accept a shortlist of white middle class men with no women. So they looked at it again, and then she was on the shortlist, and then there were people who were against her.
Not so simple to
deliver
change
reasons.
clearly, because you have to be resistant.
I had to be
But
so
lead from the top.
resistant.
I think that's the point.
Huge resistance, and people saying to me, well, Mr. Speaker, you should accept that so-and-so is the preferred candidate, and you must withdraw your support for the Reverend Rose. And I said, no, I'm not prepared to do that. I'm absolutely not prepared to do that. I insist on proceeding with the idea of her appointment. And in the end, you know, I got my way, but it was a pretty bloody experience. Okay. And that was just one. I mean, it happened on several other occasions as well.
Yeah. Okay, so coming back to, I'm moving chronologically, hopefully. Within the ministry, I remember, the Benazir Income Support Program, there were a few processes I'd like to flag. The first one was the payment process. The beneficiaries had been paid through post office initially. Then they moved on to many other things. The most significant was the ATMs. Yep. They moved on to getting cash through ATMs. And when I came in, I moved that entire payment process. Yep. Huge shift in terms of technological shift, training of the 6 million uneducated women.
Yep.
We moved it to biometrically verified system, which was easier, which was simpler, because women did not know how to function on the ATM. They were getting lost, and they were not being able to retrieve their money, so they were sending middlemen to get it, and they were being charged commission fee by them.
Right.
So
they were getting a rake
they were
off.
losing, so if they were losing a couple of hundred rupees on every thousands of rupees, right? So this cut out the middlemen, and they put their thumb right there on the little POS machine, and they were able to collect their money without any hassle. So that was one of the changes. The second one I'm really proud of is the National Socioeconomic Registry of the Benazir Income Support Program, which has been there for some time. But the improvements that we made, the technological improvements that we made, that everything was moved from paper-based environment. So taking the surveys which were done from paper-based became tablet-based.
Yep.
And so it was real-time information coming. And to see that on dashboards was, you know, I've always been one for dashboards. I think all my life, if you talk about change management, I've always managed through dashboards and grids. Okay. And so it goes back to the Citibank style of managing. And even the next one, when I talk about, you know, dashboard management and training of the public sector employees, not such an obvious one. There's a big difference between private sector and public sector in most countries. And when you talk about training them, when you talk about the HR aspect of it, and when you talk about managing through dashboards, managing through quality management, you know, tools, it's easier said than done. So that's a huge change in an organization which was about 2,300 people at the time, 400 offices all over the country, which had to be replicated in all the country, in all the 400 stations. So those changes, whatever you were making in the head office, were being replicated across. And
therefore made a big difference.
Therefore made a big difference, you know.
And particularly vulnerable women.
Following on from this was the Benazir Income Support Program, BIS beneficiary committees, women committees, who were able to spread the women empowerment message. We had BIS beneficiary committees, meaning groups of women getting together and meeting and discussing things, but we had never pushed them to discuss women empowerment issues per se. They were discussing whether they were getting their payments on time or not, but we inculcated a kind of strategy in that BBC where they were encouraged to discuss other issues, the issues that they were having as women, and their nutrition needs, their vaccination needs, their education needs for their children, and also any domestic violence, you name it. Every single gender issue was pushed through those beneficiary committees, and suddenly the beneficiary committees were the change movement. And they became like, it was like a revolutionary thing, that these women were really powerful, and then they spoke up and said, we are the BIS beneficiary committee, I'm a mother leader, and I have an opinion on this. Suddenly they became really big, and some of them went on to become councillors in local government.
Okay.
Right? So you were pushing a huge women empowerment change through committees. There was about 63,000 of them, capturing about 1.25 million women.
Wow.
Not a joke. So that's my experience on the ministry side. Over to you.
Well, 2 decades ago, the Youth Parliament in the UK was formed, and I used to have an involvement with them on a very, very small scale. Just before I became Speaker, the House voted with my support to allow the Youth Parliament to have an annual debate in the chamber of the House on a non-sitting Friday. It was due to be chaired by the Deputy Speaker, because the Speaker, my predecessor, was normally in his constituency on a Friday, and so he wasn't keen to be in London. When I was elected Speaker, I said I will chair those proceedings, and I said to the Youth Parliament, I'll chair those proceedings from start to finish every year of my speakership. And I did it for 2 reasons. First, I thought I would enjoy it, of course. But secondly, I thought if we want to be respected by young people, we must show respect for young people.
Excellent.
And so every year from 2009 to 2018,
what a rich,
I chaired those proceedings and tried to encourage and
what rich feedback you must have received.
Reward the youngsters by telling them what was good, what was beneficial, what was really exceptional by the way of their leadership.
You mentored so many people in the process.
Well, I mean, it was a kind of mentoring, yes. I mean, I'm not saying that I had huge numbers of interactions of a great length with them, but I met literally thousands of young people over that period. And I also said to them, I'll chair these proceedings every year, and I make you an offer. I'll come to your conference, wherever it takes place in the United Kingdom, and talk to you and be questioned by you every year. And I did that every year for a decade. Now, there were people who said, Mr. Speaker, you don't need to do that. You know, you don't need to be present all the time. You know, just welcoming me is enough. And I thought, I don't just want to do that minimalist thing of saying hello and shaking hands and goodbye because I've got something more important to do. I thought, well, it's one day a year that I'm welcoming them, and it's one day a year that I'm going to their conference. So 2 days out of my 365 days. But what did it mean to them? I think it probably offered them some significant encouragement. But there was opposition.
Of course.
And, you know, I remember one member, a very senior but elderly member, saying to me that he was outraged that the Youth Parliament was meeting in Westminster, and even more outraged that I intended to sanctify their proceedings by chairing those proceedings. And he said, you mark my words, Mr. Speaker, I'm literally flecks of spittle coming out of his mouth, and he went absolutely bright red and said, "You mark my words, Mr. Speaker, at the very least, when those young people come to the chamber, chewing gum will be left all over the chamber. And at the worst, penknives will be used, and damage will be inflicted on these benches that I
look
know."
at the kind of
What
opposition.
a reactionary
Yeah,
fossil.
look
What
at
a
the
complete, old-fashioned, backward-looking, antediluvian, bigoted twerp he was. And I say, not for my own sake or in my own defence, but as a tribute to the members of the Youth Parliament, that I said to that bloke, I make 3 predictions to you. They'll be proud to come, they'll speak well,
Yes.
and they'll behave a damn sight better
And they
than
did.
do.
And they did.
Right on all
I'm
3
glad-
counts. So that was, a small change, but it was a change worth making. And I was amazed by the discordant voices, the reactionary types who said, "Oh, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it." Well, now everybody accepts it.
Yeah. Coming back to me, I would say the next one I'd like to mention is the Flood Commission that
The
Flood Commission
Flood
within the
Commission.
Supreme Court that I was responsible for, because I petitioned all the governments in
Yeah.
the super floods because they had all not performed as per standards which I believed were necessary. We'd lost a lot of people
Yeah.
in 2011 and 10 and 11. And so using the Supreme Court as the bully pulpit, I was able to manage that change.
Yep.
And we came up with an incredible Supreme Court Flood Commission report, which to date is the gospel, if you like,
Yep.
on how you manage or how you should be managing floods. Now that was a huge amount of stakeholders. The entire country's attorney generals were stacked on one side, me alone on the
On
other
the other.
side. Like putting up my case in front of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And as a parliamentarian, that's the first time I dealt with. I wasn't a lawyer.
No.
So I was managing.
You're not a lawyer, but back.
No, I'm not. But I managed, and we won that case, and we have that Supreme Court report. To date, if only governments were to follow that report, they'd get massive savings and save a lot of lives. Now, the point I'm trying to make over here is that I was part of a process that initiated huge amount of change at different levels
Yes.
on ground for better flood management at
Yeah.
every level. Were we able to produce the kind of results that we wanted? To date, no. But were we able to make a dent and give the right path forward?
Yeah.
Yes. And do we still keep an eye on things? Yes, we do. So that's one aspect of it. Over to you.
Well, I wanted to establish an education centre in Parliament. We're one of the oldest parliaments in the world, but we didn't have an education centre.
Imagine.
And I wanted to create a digital, cutting-edge, state-of-the-art, interactive education centre which would enable us to attract another 100,000 young people to visit Parliament and to learn digitally about the journey, Marvi, from the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215
Wow.
to the rights and responsibilities of citizens today. Now, again, there were objections to that facility. One or two of the tabloid newspapers said it was going to cost several £1,000,000. Yes, it did. It was an absolutely justified and, in my
Expenditure.
opinion, far-sighted investment. Absolutely, and all these young people are now coming and seeing
So investments in change.
digitally what has changed and what democracy means today and what transition has taken place in the make-up and fortunes of the country. So it was definitely the right thing to do, but we can't be accused of hurrying it. I tend to joke that it was opened in September 2015, in the year that we marked the 800th anniversary
Wow.
of the signing of the Magna Carta. So in Britain, and this is in a sense almost a byword for the operation of British parliamentary democracy, we tend to proceed quite slowly. And ironically, it was me and a young official, who better remain nameless because she's a private citizen, but a young official in the House, young, bright, dynamic official, was very keen to go, and a small number of other people were involved as well. But we worked on it from start to finish, and we resolved that it was going to be made to happen. Did I sense any huge enthusiasm, from the most traditional elements in the House? Not really. They weren't necessarily strongly opposed, but they weren't particularly interested. It was a small group of people that drove it, and I was absolutely determined to make it happen. And it's there, and it will last.
And these are processes that you have left behind.
Yeah.
That's good to hear. The next one for me is running for elections in a feudal setup. I'm not from a feudal background, so for me that was a huge change for me to manage personally, and for me to explain to my constituency that why did they need a woman who was not a feudal. They had certain expectations of their members of parliament, and I obviously was very different to what they had seen in the past. I was obviously educated, I wasn't feudal, I wasn't going to go ahead with their corrupt practices. So for me to explain and to train and to educate as to why they needed honest politicians who had nothing to do with eating from them, unfortunately, sounds quite, strange, but it was.
What, are you saying that it involved almost a fight back against corrupt ethos?
Yes, absolutely, because they had been fed that from the beginning. So for them to change their mindset as to know their leaders are not going to be corrupt, no, their leaders will not be partaking from the fruits of corruption, that was something. And also that I wasn't feudal, that I didn't have that mindset, and that I was a woman. That woman aspect, I think, was relatively easier in my society. I always say that in Sufi Sindh it's fairly simple. For me, I have managed superbly personally. Others might not have had the same experience, but the feudal aspect was there, and so that.
It has to be said, the feudal aspect in the UK was very strongly established at one time. Although I think of it now as a very, very, very long time ago, and there have always been some good features to British parliamentary practice. There was, frankly, a culture of what used to be called treating in the British Parliament. It hasn't existed for a long time, but in earlier centuries it did. It was quite established practice for a prominent candidate for Parliament to be expected to treat, that is to say, to throw parties, to buy drinks for people, to offer them meals. Now all of that is now illegal, but it didn't used to be. So
it's a process of change. Absolutely. What else from your end?
I have always been passionate about universities, and I wanted to establish links with universities, and I did that in two ways. One was by paying personal visits. I visited 60 plus universities during my time as speaker, giving lectures, answering questions, engaging in debates on issues of interest and importance. And that mattered to me because I'd had a great time at university myself, and I thought it had a transformative impact on my life, and I wanted to reach out to universities and to engage with them. The second respect in which I wanted to make a change was that I was quite struck by the fact that a lot of people could do a politics degree for 3 years but not actually know all that much about Parliament. In a lot of politics degrees, the syllabus doesn't really focus on Parliament, and people learn about presidents and prime ministers and political parties.
The executive but not legislature.
Exactly. And I thought, no, I think people ought to focus on the legislature. And in this respect, I must say, I did have significant help from senior officials because they were attracted to the idea as well. And we developed a parliamentary studies module, which is now operational across 20 universities throughout the UK.
Must have been quite a bit of change management.
And there was quite a lot of change to be made there. And there wasn't great resistance. It was more an administrative challenge to establish it. But I remember I attracted what I would call quizzical glances and a degree of surprise when I said, well, can I have a list of the 20 universities that are now operating the module, because I want to visit them all. And that clearly was regarded as surprising. And one senior official said to me, you don't need to visit them all, Mr. Speaker. That's not necessary at all. And I said, well, I don't know whether it's necessary, but it's what I want to do. Why not? Why not be a guest lecturer at these institutions?
We've done a lot of grounds.
And just leave things for other people to do. Think not so much hubristically or egocentrically of oneself, but think of the office. And I think you thought of the office, and you had your office, the position you held, and you thought, well, how am I going to use my power to make a difference? And I thought, well, I'm the temporary occupant of this office. I am the holder at the moment, and I want to make a mark.
A lot of grassroots work,
people,
isn't it?
It's quite a lot of grassroots work.
And
I think
that's
people
what gives
will think,
us
well,
our
actually,
edge, perhaps.
We'd like to have this bloke come along.
I think the grassroots work that you have identified and the one that I have been doing, frankly, that's the one that makes a difference in terms of how we sell change. If we didn't have that kind of grassroots knowledge and expertise, I think it would become very difficult to actually persuade other stakeholders, because I knew it all, like the flood. I had visited every single place with it, and I had followed the flood 3 times. So when they challenged me, I knew my stuff because I had done it myself. I wasn't dependent on. But not every single time will you be in a position where you've walk the process throughout. No. So you need good processes to manage information from that side. I just want to leave it at that. And though our list of change management between you and myself is huge, we've only given a bit of a menu to our viewers today. I'd say a couple of percentage points. but the last one I want to mention is social media. I was the first politician on Twitter and social media, and the way I was encouraged was that anchors wanted to know, what does a parliamentarian do? We don't know. Why don't you go onto Twitter, explain what you do the whole day, so you're more transparent and we can hold you accountable. Yeah. And so I started that process on July 14th. In fact, it is July 14 today.
Yes,
2009.
July 14th.
So 2009 that was. It's 2022 now.
Wow.
And that many years back is when the first tweet of a politician in Pakistan went out. And since then, now
on the 14th of July
2009.
It was a Wednesday.
How do you know that?
Well, I happen to know.
And so on that particular Wednesday, that process started. It was a huge change.
No, it wasn't actually. No, it wasn't.
Okay, no, it wasn't.
It was a Tuesday.
It was a Tuesday.
It was 22 days after I was elected Speaker.
Okay, so this
particular
portion of it has to be cut out, okay, about the Wednesday and the Tuesday. Yeah, anyway, so coming back to that change, for the first time, politicians' days were transparent, accountable. And to manage social media then and to be on social media today is a totally different ballgame. It has worsened over a period of time. You know, it has become a lot of chores. But to manage that process, that's change management. And we've seen how other politicians have come on. Not every single politician is on it. It's not a big deal. You know,
Sure.
Initially it was a big deal. So what I'm trying to say is that we've discussed a lot of change management. We've discussed change and management. We've discussed our own personal experiences. We've given a little bit of an overview of the kind of massive processes that we were part of. A lot of processes from a government and executive point of view, or from which are very, very relevant to how corporates manage. You know?
Sure.
And the menu is really large. We look forward to discussing more change management going forward. And what else? How would you like to close today? I'll let you close today.
Well, I think roles can evolve.
Okay.
And they do. And the Speaker's role could and did evolve. And if I summarise at the end, I would say that my overarching intention was to build some sort of relationship with civil society. So I wanted to go from Parliament to the people and to bring the people to Parliament. And the way I did that really was through public engagement, visiting schools and colleges and universities and faith groups and charitable bodies on a scale that no speaker had done before. And there were people who criticised it. No, Mr. Speaker, you don't need to be going out of the House. People know your role. It's not for you to go traipsing around the country.
Have to be met.
And then I said, well, look, I've got these wonderful rooms, the state rooms, the rooms where you had your dinner in celebration of your award. And they're sitting there, and they should be used. And that is why I was proud to host 1,000 events over 10 years for charitable organisations, because surely that's what you should do. And I was always struck when people said, but Mr. Speaker, they're your rooms. And I said, well, they're my rooms in the sense that I'm the temporary resident of them. They don't belong to me. And they should be used for public purposes.
Absolutely.
Surely, if they're at the heart of the British Parliament, I should be using them to showcase great voluntary charitable endeavours right across the country. And to me, that wasn't just a duty, although it was a duty, it was a privilege.
Thank you. And on that note, in terms of change management, I'd just like to say evaluate, assess and adjust is what is generally said in change management.
Yeah.
But we have gone a step forward and we've looked at the roles of how parliaments could potentially be legislating change before society makes a move towards that.
Don't have to wait for the public always to be on side.
Or we follow society. It can work either way.
Sure.
But to end, I would like to say that a public-private partnership between corporates and the legislative and the executive branch is most suitable, so that whatever change management has to take place is done holistically, is done comprehensively, and has some sustainable model attached to it.
Absolutely.
On that very note, we will say goodbye from Kensington Palace and hope to catch you next time on Parliamentary Pondering. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.